Transmitiendo desde las antenas de lava de la maravillosa ciudad universitaria, estamos al aire desde el MUAC. Hoy presentamos el libro Seguir con el problema, generar parentesco en el Introducen, con una conversación de Donna Haraway y Cristina Rivera Garza. Este programa es posible gracias al apoyo de nuestros colaboradores Consonni y Fauna. Ahora sí, vámonos en vivo.
Transmitiendo desde las pedregosas antenas de lava de la maravillosa ciudad universitaria, les habla Ekaterina Álvarez en la cabina del museo. Señoras, señores, apaguen la luz y escuchen. Duerman a los niños, silencien a sus mascotas, suban el volumen de los auriculares porque nos encontramos al aire desde el MUAC. El día de hoy con la presentación del libro Seguir con el problema. Una conversación entre Donna Haraway y Cristina Rivera Garza. Con este programa damos inicio a nuestra serie Al aire. Con la actuación y participación de la siempre bella y distinguida comunidad de la cultura en México y el extranjero, el museo abre sus micrófonos. En esta ocasión tenemos el gusto y posibilidad de ofrecer este programa gracias al apoyo de nuestras colaboradoras y editoras, Consonni y Fauna. Esta conversación ocurre en 2 o más idiomas con la promesa de ofrecer un subtitulaje posterior. Y ahora sí, nos vamos en vivo con la carismática voz de Sara Schulz, que en esta ocasión introduce esta, que es nuestra primera emisión.
Mi nombre es Sara y estoy aquí en representación de Consonni, a nombre de Fauna también, que desde el diciembre pasado distribuye sus publicaciones en México. La editorial ha preparado un video que fue originalmente ideado para los libreros en México, pero que nos encantó y presentamos aquí con ustedes. Corre video.
Queridas librerías mexicanas, Consonni es una editorial, a día de hoy es una editorial, pero llevamos en el mundo de la cultura, pues el año que viene vamos a hacer 25 años. Sí que se empezó más desde la producción de arte contemporáneo, con proyectos artísticos, y un poco fue a raíz de los propios proyectos que fuimos trabajando cada vez más la parte editorial y de la edición.
Para nosotras es muy importante editar y producir cultura crítica.
A día de hoy decimos que trabajamos con la palabra hecha cuerpo, la palabra escrita, la palabra susurrada, la palabra declamada.
Nosotras publicamos crítica cultural y ahora mismo estamos muy enfocadas en publicar ensayo político, en ficciones que también son políticas y feministas, y para nosotras es fundamental amplificar voces que construyen narrativas que nos ayudan a imaginar un mundo con más sentido, ¿no?
Para nosotras desde Consonni es muy importante el objeto, el libro, y por eso trabajamos el diseño de toda la colección con Rosa Shop y también en cada una de las portadas trabajamos con artistas o ilustradoras. En estos casos, por ejemplo, Donna Haraway es Geraldine Javier y en el caso de la novela es la ilustradora Carla Berrocal. En México llegamos con estos 2 títulos que para nosotras son 2 títulos muy importantes dentro de nuestra editorial. Y en concreto el primero que publicamos en esta colección, El origen del mundo, es Donna Haraway, Seguir con el problema, que es un título que se vuelve muy necesario a días de hoy. Unas teorías en las que Donna Haraway también nos habla de aprender a vivir en un planeta herido, nos habla también de aprender a convivir con virus, con otros seres vivos.
The list of troubles is immense, and staying with them with good heart, with each other. Not in some kind of spirit of cynicism or of optimism, either one, but rather a kind of living with each other to help make a more robust now, a more robust present.
Y en concreto este título, Match Piercy, Mujer al borde del tiempo, es un título que Donna Haraway nombra también en el propio ensayo y que utiliza también para construir sus propias teorías. Y también es un título que nos parece muy idóneo en momentos actuales para imaginar y pensar también con utopías, ¿no?
Utopian writing doesn't come from people just sitting down to create a good society. It comes from pain. It comes from the things you don't have.
Precisamente la protagonista y la voz de la protagonista, que es muy fuerte porque se trata de una mujer chicana en Nueva York que sufre el maltrato institucional porque está encerrada en una institución psiquiátrica, y a raíz de ese maltrato que sufre, de las malas prácticas que se dan en ese centro, pasa por varias situaciones diferentes en las que tiene que estar en varios centros psiquiátricos. De ahí, de esa presión y de esas sensaciones que vive ella, nace la utopía que luego se desarrolla en este libro.
Enseguida llegan estos libros a México. Estamos muy contentas de que lleguen estas lecturas que consideramos tan importantes a un país que nos ha dado tanto y en el que hemos disfrutado tanto cada vez que hemos ido. Es un país además con el que tenemos una conexión personal, emocional y familiar incluso, así que nos hace ilusión que justo este año que no podemos viajar por la pandemia, que no vamos a poder estar allí, lo podemos hacer de otra forma, y es a través de los libros y a través de estas lecturas. Así que nos vemos, México. Agur.
Bueno, ese fue el video de Consonni. Me gusta pensar los libros como objetos migrantes, artefactos explosivos o insólitos y únicos. Aunque haya muchas copias de algún título, se materializan de forma individual y son capaces de desmontar sistemas e ideologías, aun siendo parte de ellos, casi como un virus o un parásito. Sin volverlos fetiches, los libros son dispositivos, es decir, están dispuestos a crear, producir acciones, ocasionar, y así se han ajustado al tiempo, al paso de los siglos, las eras, las circunstancias, como las actuales. Son cuerpos detonantes que nos permiten enlazarnos en un pensamiento colectivo, pero singular, como el que tiene lugar hoy, aquí, que tiende puentes entre nuestros pasajes ocultos, alianzas, complicidades, afinidades, riesgos compartidos y deseos. Hay cierto erotismo en los libros que nos impulsa a comunicarnos con el tacto, pasando las manos sobre las mismas páginas y los ojos sobre las lecturas. Es en este espacio en el que muchas veces nos movemos hacia otros futuros posibles y anhelados. Hoy presentamos el libro de Donna Haraway, Seguir con el problema, seguir en el problema, seguir por el problema. Celebramos también la llegada de la editorial Consonni a México. Y no queda más que agradecer la ausencia presente de todas aquí, por ser indicio de que en estos momentos hay más que aislamiento y miedo. Hay necesidad de transformación. En la lectura hay interfaces, hay interconexión, hay azar, pero también hay intención y hay potencia. Gracias, Donna, gracias, Cristina, María y Montserrat, equipo de Consonni y del MUAC, equipo de Fauna, Klaus y Cris, que ha distribuido ya aún con semáforo rojo y COVID los libros en varios espacios, que forman también sus propias redes de amistad y acogida. Seguimos con Virginia.
Gracias, Sara. Bienvenidas todas, es un gusto tenerlas aquí. Sé que hay mucha gente esperando escuchar a Donna y a Cristina, así que me limitaré a introducirlas muy brevemente. Como muchas conocerán, Donna Haraway escribe y da clases sobre estudios de la ciencia y la tecnología, teoría feminista y estudios multiespecies. Es profesora emérita de los programas de Historia de la Conciencia y Estudios Feministas en la Universidad de California en Santa Cruz. Entre sus libros destacan Manifiesto Cyborg, Ciencias, Cyborgs y Mujeres, la reinvención de la naturaleza, Manifiesto de las especies de compañía o El patriarcado del osito Teddy. El libro que hoy se presenta, Seguir con el problema, fue publicado en inglés en 2016 y la editorial Consonni lo publicó en español en el 2019. Llega ahora a México, gracias a Fauna, en un momento crucial para el país, que está sumido en el desgarro de la violencia y los feminicidios, como lo ocurrido recientemente en Chiapas. Cristina Rivera Garza es escritora mexicana y catedrática en el Colegio de Artes Liberales y Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Houston, donde fundó el programa doctoral de estudios hispánicos centrados en la escritura creativa. Recientemente obtuvo la prestigiosa beca MacArthur Fellowship. Su último libro, Autobiografía del algodón, ahonda en la industria agrícola en México desde su experiencia familiar migrante. Es un lujo tenerlas ambas aquí. Gracias, Cristina, and thank you, Donna. Porque tomando palabras prestadas de Haraway, ambas creo que son cómplices para configurar mundos de manera conjunta, en compañía, en simpoiesis. Tanto Donna como Cristina investigan nuevas relaciones entre humanos, entre especies, y articulan diversos juegos de cuerdas, de cuidados y pensamiento tentacular. Como dice Haraway, importa qué historias contamos para contar con ellas otras historias. Importa qué conceptos pensamos para pensar con ellos otros conceptos. Las historias pertenecen a quienes las cuentan, a quienes las comparten o no en prácticas situadas de configuración de mundos. Así que desde el MOAC estamos muy felices de poder iniciar este devenir con para seguir con el problema. Estaremos recogiendo las preguntas en el chat del Facebook, que está activo, y doy paso a Cristina para que dé inicio a la conversación.
Muchas gracias, Virginia. Gracias a todos. Gracias por la invitación. Bienvenida, Donna. Very welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. Vamos a organizar una cosa un poco interesante aquí. Yo voy a estar hablando en español. Donna entiende y habla un poco de español, ¿no? Pero algunas cosas de las que voy a estar diciendo, voy a tratar de decirlas también en inglés para que Donna pueda hacer su parte también en inglés, ¿ok? Entonces, en eso estamos de acuerdo. Gracias por estar aquí. Yo en estas ocasiones, como este libro es tan complejo, es tan amplio, hay tantas maneras de entrar en él, podría estar platicando horas sin sentir. Entonces decidí apuntar algunas ideas para no perderme demasiado y tratar de ir organizando, porque tenemos solo más o menos 40 minutos y acuérdense que después al final de esos 40 minutos va a haber oportunidad para que Donna también atienda a las preguntas que nos lleguen por el chat. Entonces, primero, antes que nada, me da un gusto enorme estar aquí para celebrar este libro en muchos sentidos. Me da mucho gusto, aquí lo tengo, celebrar la traducción de Ellen Torres, que nos entrega Seguir con el problema, para que nosotros podamos también generar parentesco, producir tribu en nuestros contextos. Y bueno, celebrar también la llegada a México del proyecto editorial Consonni, que está dedicada, como ya oyeron en el video, a producir y editar cultura crítica, que es por supuesto otra manera de generar parentescos alternativos y alternativas y tribus en movimiento. Está de más decir, pero hay que decirlo, que yo creo que hay muchas personas en el público hoy que han crecido, que hemos crecido, varias generaciones ya de mujeres críticas, feministas y no, personas que hemos aquilatado lo fundamental, la cita que hace ratito nos leía Virginia, lo fundamental que son las historias con las que contamos nuestras historias, lo importante que son las ideas con las que vamos ideando, los nudos con los que vamos anudando nuestra existencia. Entonces yo creo que Donna Haraway ha sido ya desde mucho antes de quedarnos con el problema, en este rastreo, en estar alerta, con lo que con ella hemos aprendido a quedarnos en el presente, a tratar de volver a ese presente un sitio más hospitalario, más en común con otros, más consciente de que compartimos la superficie de la tierra, no solo con los seres humanos que han dejado sus huellas, para que nosotros podamos posar nuestros pies ahí, reconociendo en nuestro andar, en apariencia solitario, un andar ya de entrada, ya en sí, ya radicalmente con otros, sino también con todas esas otras compañías de otras especies con las que nos hemos domesticado en conjunto o con las que nos hemos vuelto salvajes en conjunto, en una pertenencia mutua y, por qué no decirlo, en una dependencia también mutua. No hay, ya lo decía el poeta africanoamericano Fred Moten, no hay solistas, solo hay acompañamiento. Y me gusta empezar esta conversación, estas preguntas que pienso hacerle a Donna Haraway, citando también las palabras de otros con los que he ido pensando, con cuyas historias también he ido construyendo mis historias. Oyeron aquí algunas ideas, resonancias, por ejemplo, de José Revueltas y su teoría de las huellas, y estas ideas sobre el acompañamiento y los solistas con el poeta Fred Moten. Ay Dios, si estamos todavía aquí, sí estamos. Como todo artefacto complejo, como toda experiencia que se nos entrega en capas densas de complejidad, hay múltiples maneras de caminar por este libro y voy a elegir tres. 3 rastreos, 3 trayectorias, 3 recorridos, tal vez 3 figuras de cuerdas con las que he ido guiando mi andar en estos últimos años. Me interesa, como a Donna Haraway, quedarme en el presente, vivir en el presente, reconocer el peso del pasado, por supuesto, un pasado que nunca es pasado, como ya lo decía de una manera dolorosa y a la vez liberadora Cristina Sharp en ese fabuloso libro que se llama In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, y también avisorando al futuro, pero un futuro que siempre ya está aquí con nosotros también. Esas dos cosas, sin embargo, creo que nos sirven para quedarme, me sirven a mí al menos para quedarme en el presente. Me interesa crear ese parentesco, trabajar con otros en el presente y aprender a vivir y a morir también con esta responsabilidad de la que habla Donna Haraway. Al rato quiero regresar a este tema porque morir en estos días en que estamos rodeados de muerte, morir en tiempos de COVID, seguramente le ha hecho pensar muchas cosas a Donna Haraway y me gustaría saber, de entrada, saber cuáles son. Pero antes de llegar ahí, permítanme continuar solo un poquito con una historia sobre este presente, con esa forma del problema que consiste en estar en alerta, en ser una alerta, más allá de las soluciones tecnológicas, los technofixes de los que habla Donna, y más allá también del fatalismo. So let me just, to make sure that we are in communication. What I'm saying right now, Donna, is that obviously I think that many of us have been thinking with you and have been telling our stories through your story. And we are being conceiving and sharing ideas that are very much related to your work as well. So I'm absolutely grateful and thrilled, in fact, to being here, to be just here, able to talk with you. I was telling our friends in Spanish that obviously there are so many ways to get into your book, to walk into your book, so to speak. I've chosen 3 of them, and they have to do with the questions that I'm planning on posing for you. And right now I'm about to start, I'm about to describe these 3 big questions or explorations that I would like to share with you today. All right. So let me see if I find my document here. This is crazy. So first of all, I have to tell you a story. Les tengo que contar una historia. Y esta es la historia que hace un año yo asigné este libro, Seguir con el problema, en un seminario de escritura creativa que impartí en la Universidad de Houston, alrededor de lo que me ha dado por llamar escrituras geológicas. Ahí poníamos atención a discusiones, creo yo, centrales de nuestro tiempo, tratando de responder con toda responsabilidad a las provocaciones de los nuevos materialismos. La pregunta era entonces, como sigue siendo ahora, ¿qué significa escribir si creemos, y de verdad creemos, que estamos en una etapa que algunos denominan antropoceno, otros denominan capitaloceno. Ya sabemos que Donna Haraway tiene sus sospechas alrededor de estas dos y que tiene su propia alternativa, pero en ambos casos creo que nos enfrentamos a una situación de emergencia en la que estamos en la que la extinción y el fin y muchas formas del fin no son nada más producto de la ficción, sino una posibilidad material concreta. Si creemos que la actividad de la humanidad y de la humanidad en contacto con sus otras especies acompañantes y viceversa también, que se organiza alrededor de un sistema de explotación extractivista que tiene como punto de referencia en común a la acumulación originaria, la pregunta, repito, es ¿cómo podemos escribir cuentos, novela, poesía con eso sobre nosotros? ¿De qué manera esta conciencia de ser otros, de compartir nuestro territorio con otros, los que estuvieron aquí antes y que ya no están y por cuya ausencia ocupamos ese lugar, esos otros humanos, pero también esos otros no humanos, esas palomas de las que nos habla Donna Haraway, pero también las mariposas monarcas y tal vez también el algodón del que yo he escrito o la resina de lo que escriben otros? ¿Cómo transformará esa conciencia, esa creencia, también esa convicción que compartimos de que compartimos este mundo con otros? ¿Cómo nos transformará eso? ¿Cómo transformará nuestras prácticas como escritores? Se podrán imaginar que Seguir con el problema se convirtió de inmediato en una serie de ideas que nos invitaron a repensar lo que somos ahora y lo que seremos en poco tiempo, todavía dentro del presente. Me interesó de entrada que de este llamado a la ficción especulativa o al feminismo especulativa como un método de rastreo. Esas figuras de cuerdas, menos como metáforas y más como una semiótica material situada y mundana, imbricada y a veces, como no, enredada en miles de fuerzas más. Pero ahí la cuestión, todo eso para ver quién vive y quién muere. Y sabiéndolo, detectándolo, ¿qué podemos hacer para proponernos hacer la pregunta sobre la justicia? Esto que es algo que le interesaba muchísimo a un pensador chileno que se llama Sergio Villalobos Ruminot, ¿no? Hacer la pregunta sobre la acumulación y hacer la pregunta sobre la justicia. Pero aquí, con Donna Haraway, la pregunta sobre la justicia no solo es una justicia humana, sino de una justicia multiespecie. Y eso lo hace especialmente interesante. Siempre escribimos con otro, eso lo he dicho yo en todos lados, de eso se ha tratado mucho de las ideas que he compartido con ustedes recientemente. Tal vez la primera pregunta que me planteo como escritora no es sobre qué escribo, sino con quién estoy ya escribiendo de entrada, por pensar de esta manera y no de otra, ¿no? Escribir, Haraway tiene razón, es pensar con otros. La teoría convertida aquí en esa bolsa donde uno va colectando, cargando, transportando, contando, las así llamadas cosas de la vida. Una vida además en contacto con la tierra como una naturacultura. Una escritura terrestre, sin lugar a dudas, como la llamaría Latour, o una escritura geológica, como me ha dado a llamarla a mí, o con cualquier otro nombre, pero una escritura con otros apegada a la siempre conflictiva materialidad del territorio. Si no creemos ya en la trascendencia de lo humano por sobre todo lo demás, ¿cómo cambiará nuestra noción misma de personaje? ¿Cómo escribiremos diálogos cuando los participantes pertenezcan a especies en compañía, pero no en similitud? La experiencia nos ha enseñado que las historias lineales dejan mucho que pedir, pero ¿qué tipo de estructura y qué tipo de método nos ayudará a entretejer palabras con la experiencia de un mundo radicalmente compartido? Esas más o menos eran y han sido las preguntas, esas las discutimos en mi seminario, en mi taller, y Donna Haraway cuenta al menos algunas de sus respuestas aquí. Me interesa la riqueza de esas historias que se desarrollan junto a los pichones, sus primeras guías en este libro, pero todavía más, y por razones muy personales, me interesa mucho la historia de Donna Haraway y la mariposa monarca en la sección de las historias de Camille, Los niños de la composta. Hay que ir a los lugares heridos, dice Donna Haraway, a los lugares arruinados, algo que también hizo Anna Tsing en su fabuloso libro sobre el hongo, ¿no? Ahorita no me acuerdo del nombre. Pero no hay que ir como los turistas o los escritores que se interesan en nombrar el desastre, ¿no? O incluso darle nombre a ese desastre, sino como los seres en proceso de devenir otros, que en cuanto tal, convirtiéndose en otros, pueden generar el tipo de relaciones en común capaces de sanar, si no completamente, al menos sí parcialmente, al menos sí para hacer cosas en común en esos mismos territorios. Tenemos que ir, dice Donna Haraway, tenemos que ir con otros y por otros, porque en esa cosmopolítica, en esa escritura teñida por la cosmopolítica, de quedarnos con el problema, las decisiones que deben tomarse se toman por aquellos que sufrirán las consecuencias de las decisiones. Algo que, por ejemplo, Raquel Gutiérrez decía también, esta pensadora feminista y activista, decía muy bien en aquella frase de, pues, lo que todo nos importa porque todo nos afecta, ¿no? Les cuento una vez más y con esto ya espero ya llegar a las preguntas y darle la voz a Donna Haraway, que es a lo que ustedes vienen a hacer aquí. Visité muchas veces los territorios por los que pasaba la mariposa monarca en el Estado de México. En varias ocasiones, viajando por la carretera, tuvimos que bajar la velocidad de manera radical para poder atravesar los caminos por los que se posaban sus alas. Mi hijo, siendo entonces un niño muy pequeño, alzó los brazos al cielo para traer hacia sí la presencia de las monarcas hacia su cuerpo. Pronto nos enteramos, como muchos otros, de los peligros de la extinción y luego también, como tantos otros, dejamos de escuchar sobre todo aquello. Tal vez uno de los momentos más felices de mi lectura de este libro tenga que ver con este reencuentro con las mariposas monarca. Escribir sobre ellas y con ellas, volverse un escritor terrestre o geológico, implicó establecer una serie de planes y estructuras institucionales y no, que favorecieron la exploración material y documental del territorio de las monarcas, un territorio compartido por comunidades mazahua. Hubo que investigar las condiciones del agua, de la propiedad de la tierra, de otras formas de extracción en el mismo lugar, para poder escribir con otros, para escribir, como yo diría también, de manera comunalista, no solo de manera comunitaria, no solo a través del trabajo colectivo, no solo a través de comunidades enteras, entre ellas la comunidad científica, pero comunalistamente en el sentido de estar produciendo y reproduciendo esos contextos materiales de existencia, esos lugares dañados y arruinados, heridos en todo caso, como los menciona Donna Haraway en su libro. Se trata, claro, de una simpoiesis cuyo fin último no es ser escritor, o ser científico, o ser experto, sino ser responsable, actuar con responsabilidad. Entonces, aquí va la primera de las preguntas que quiero dirigirle, de la que me gustaría con Donna, es acerca del entramado de esta escritura material en el territorio de las monarcas. Desde quién participó hasta quién financió, desde qué hay que hacer qué tendríamos que hacer nosotros si quisiéramos continuar escribiendo esta historia para contar otras historias, qué tendríamos que hacer para seguir dentro del problema y actuar dentro del problema con responsabilidad, ¿no? And so, Donna, let me see. This is a long paragraphs right here. But I was trying to describe to our friends here that I've been thinking a lot about the fact that writing is not a solitary experience or practice. We're always writing with others. In fact, when I start writing a book, I think less about what I'm writing about and more about with whom I'm writing already, just by virtue of thinking, of visualizing or exploring specific topics. So I am very convinced and very much in agreement with your book about the need to go into specific territories, to go to these wounded or damaged territories when we want to write with others. I was telling everybody that I assigned this book in a class, in a creative writing workshop that I was teaching last year at the University of Houston. It was a writing seminar about what I've been calling geological writings. Some of the questions that were guiding our conversations had to do with a shared belief that this discussion that we're having around new materialisms, for example, the discussions that we're having about how to write with our companion species, we were trying to take all of them very seriously. So if we believe that, and I believe we did believe that, the questions were, well, what are we going to be doing as writers? How are we going to, how these series of ideas are going to be transforming our very idea of what a character is? How are we going to be working with dialogue when our dialogues are not only conversations with and among humans, but conversations that we're trying to develop with species companions, with companion species too. So those were, generally speaking, some of the questions that I wanted to talk about in this seminar. So I wrote a book around the experience of cotton, autobiography of cotton, and I wanted very much to deal with cotton in the way that you're describing in your book. As a companion species, I wanted, cotton had a lot to do, was a very important component with the migratory experience of my grandparents into the United States and out of the United States. But that's just one of the many aspects that we talked about in our workshop. I was especially happy when I read the section of your book about the butterflies, the monarch butterflies. And it has to do obviously with the fact that it relates to Mexico, to an area of Mexico I know very well, because I lived for a while in the state of Mexico, very close to the Mazahua communities that you talk about in your book. So I was reminded of wonderful times that I had when we traveled through the Monarca territory, and images of my very young son, just lifting his arms and trying to attract the flying butterflies to himself. Things of that sort came to mind as I was reading that section of your book. But obviously you were dealing with a very complex perspective, with a tracing that attempted to go very deep into the territory. In order for you to speak or to write with butterflies, you had to not only meet the people from there, invited them to go to Santa Cruz, establish a network and a conversation, but also learn about some other conditions of the territory, water, property rights, other very material experiences related to extractivism and related to the forces of capitalism in the area. So this is a very complex undertaking that took years in the making, that took efforts that were yours, of course, but you were sharing with many other communities. And so because it relates to Mexico and it relates to the Mazahua communities and it relates to the Monarca butterflies, if you don't mind, I would love for you to start this conversation with our friends from Mexico and all over the Spanish-speaking world about that. And I'm aware that in talking about these Monarca butterflies and their territories, of course you will be touching, you have to talk about some of the central concepts of the book. So I think we're covering a lot of territory, and perhaps after this we might let other people ask you questions as well. So welcome again. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and it's all yours, Donna.
Okay, well, muchas gracias. Me hace muy feliz estar aquí con ustedes y lo siento que es necesario que hablo en inglés, pero entiendo mucho de su presentación.
Okay.
But it's true, I need to express myself in English with the help of my companion of the day, which is a Pacific Day octopus wearing a proper COVID cubrebroca, mascarilla, with Black Lives Matter and science is real and other important things. And you will notice that the eyes of the Pacific Day octopus are anatomically correct. They are not made cute as in a little child's toy. And so there's this octopus, which disappears into my background, is a kind of a ghost. So the monarch butterflies they fill a whole story in Seguir con el problema. They are the heart of the Camille stories, the stories of the communities of compost, of the children of compost, of the children who are born into communities who find who take their being as work to help repair, to help heal the earth through a commitment, through having babies who are from fetal gestation on bonded to beings who would not survive unless responsibility for their future is taken. And the monarchs are symbiotically bonded to the character Camille. And Camille's cosmopolitanism is along the lines of flight of the butterflies, beginning from mountaintop coal mining removal country in the eastern United States, in the southeastern and eastern United States, and the great flyway across North America, across the southern part of North America, into Mexico, and finally into Mexico and Michoacan, and into the butterfly trees, into the Oyamel fir trees of the overwintering sites of the monarchs. Meanwhile, I live in Santa Cruz on the west coast of the United States, and the great western migration of the monarch butterflies overwinters in my town in Santa Cruz on the Monterey Bay. And these butterflies in turn fly north and fly into the west, into the deserts and mountains of the west. So two great streams of butterflies are at stake in this storytelling practice, which is a profoundly materialist storytelling practice. And it's about how, from finding a particular love, a love of the beauty of the butterfly, a love of seeing the flights of the butterflies as they arrive and in my town, come into the Monterey cypress and Monterey pine trees in Natural Bridges State Park. And in Michoacan and in Morelia, in the state of Mexico, the monarchs occupy the mountains, these amazing chain of volcanic mountains, but only very particular places. So that a tiny love has already brought my attention across North and South America, well, across North and Central, across North America, well into Mexico. And in following the flight, I follow the agricultural practices, the herbicides, the pesticides, the labor practices, the coal mines, the land of conquest, the exclusion of Native Americans from these lands, the working of these lands with immigrant coal labor, the working of many of these lands with slave labor, the move through Texas and Mexico across the border, across this extraordinary border of exchange of many languages, of many Spanishes, many Englishes, many indigenous languages in the Texas-Mexican border area. An area of crossing and of wall building and of rivers and of possibility and danger. Moving into the mountains of Michoacan, one moves through the efforts of avocado growers who have in recent years and recent decades given up their combination of corn and their own crops for the cash crop of avocados, sold largely in North America, in the United States, but also in alliance, these farmers are right on the edge of monarch territory, with an area of water catchment and conservation right there. And the various campesino, both indigenous and Latino, campesino towns, their crops, their water, their politics, their conflicts, the forest, the movement through that forest into the areas where the oyamel trees are, facing climate change, facing global warming, facing the impact of excess tourism, and also facing the murder of the conservationists. So that since I visited these monarchs myself in Morelia 2 years ago, this, in January in 2019, 2 years ago, I was in the butterfly territories in Michoacan. And the week before I arrived, one of the principal activists who worked to ally the farmers with the forest conservation, with the water politics, with the tourist businesses, a terribly important conservationist was murdered. The following week, another conservationist, Mexican conservationist, was murdered. I know that just a few weeks ago, there were several more murders in this area and the closing down of the butterfly reserves. I also know that in my own town, very few butterflies have returned this winter. There are only a few dozen monarch butterflies this winter in my town, and there should be hundreds and hundreds of thousands. In the last 20 years, the migration has become very small. So I've painted much too quickly, but I've painted a picture of complexity, of connection, of responsibility, that if I take seriously a small love, loving to watch the butterflies in my town, that ties me. It ties me to their migrations, to the plants they need to feed their babies, to the farms, the agribusiness farms and the pesticides they use, to the land that has been taken by conquest and slavery, to the land under contestation for joint management agreements and sovereignty, the reinstitution of certain kinds of indigenous sovereignty across areas where these monarchs fly, into Mexico, across borders with peoples. If I'm going to take the butterflies seriously, if I'm going to, at the end of the day, be worthy of loving the butterflies, be on the way toward deserving, or I don't know, it's not a matter of deserving. If I am somehow to be able to say that it's true that I love the butterflies, if the truth is to be in the love, it's not merit, it's not deserving, there's a kind of truth. If there is a truth to loving the butterflies, then I, as a person in the world, need to be more in connection with other people, with people whose lives and deaths are at stake in the territory of these insects, to be more present to the histories, so that the present tense is both the living and the dead. It's both what is not yet and what has been. The present contains the temporalities. The present contains the times of the peoples, of the other organisms, the plants and the animals and the crops. It contains the problem of trans-mountain water transfer from the state of Michoacan to Mexico City. It brings me back to other concerns in this book about water transfer, this time not about the monarch butterflies, but about other lines of passage and lines of responsibility that move water from the Navajo Nation across mountains down to feed the cities of the Southwest, Phoenix and Los Angeles and Las Vegas, the water-hungry cities of conquest, and what that has done to the waters of the West, and the humans and the non-humans at stake. So the question is, who lives and who dies in these passages, as you said in your presentation, and as well as how to connect, because no one person or group of people can do everything, but we can connect with others who are acting for a more livable world. We can connect with other loves and other lovers. And we can activate the practices. We can figure out, for example, in the state of Michoacán, there are some questions about whether to attempt some tree plantings at higher elevations so that the next generations of butterflies might be able to find conditions in which they can survive that aren't too hot during the winter. Or not. Is that a bad idea or a good idea? And which communities of practice have to be brought together to decide? Surely scientists must be involved, but so too must the tourism operators, the farmers, the conservationists, the foresters. There are the communities of practice that must be involved in making decisions for the well-being of those who live and die in these mountains are multiple. So I'm a visitor. I learn about these things. I have a little bit to offer. I learn way more than I offer, but I can also bring back what I learn to connect where I live, to connect around questions of immigration, questions of multi-species justice, including both people and more than people. I can connect, and I can connect my friendships and my colleagueships and my passions, so that I feel like I write as a kind of conduit, a kind of that my writing is an act of lust to connect. It's a kind of being yearning to connect, and to connect through the details, through the actual living and dying, to connect through what's real, to connect through the materialities and their significance, so that anything that I do in the way of theory grows out of this kind of relentless following the lines of the specificities.
Mm-hmm. It comes very clear into page as we read the book. I mean, all the effort that goes into really tracing every single detail and the complexity that comes with it. You've mentioned so far, I mean, you describe yourself right now as a visitor, as someone who was able to go to these places or invite people to come to your place also, you know, from these areas in Michoacán and Estado de Mexico to Santa Cruz and all that. And I had told you in our very brief conversation we had before we were right here on Facebook Live that I wanted to invite you to think about in what ways the COVID and the pandemic has challenging some of the methodologies you use in this book, because we cannot go, we cannot be visitors right now, right? What can we do meanwhile as we try to connect desperately, yearning for that connection that you mentioned? So for young writers who want to become, who want to write not about something but with our companion species, what can they do in these circumstances that are going to stay with us for quite a while? This is not just a passing fade. So have you, I would love to hear your ideas.
Yes, I think that this, I have, because we're all living this, we are thinking it because we are living it. We are thinking, feeling, and I think that I'm an old woman. I'm 76 years old. It's different for me. And yet I feel my social world thinning like gauze. I feel it, the fabric, the tissue of affective connection with other human beings is thinning like gauze. And of course, I and other people do everything we can to thicken it, to restitch it, to tie it together, to continue to embroider and to weave and to tie knots. And we do it through all kinds of things. We do it, of course, through things like Zoom, which allows people who would never be able to participate in the same event to participate in this event. We do lots of things which are also sensory to connect with each other, but also to hold the place open for maintaining the capacity to connect. Because I think holding ourselves open to be ready. I do think that this is a period of loss and suffering
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of other things are happening. I have the time to learn Spanish. Lots of things are happening. Okay. By the way, I spend a few hours a day studying Spanish. And I'm taking Spanish conversation classes with a woman who lives near Mexico City, actually, for 2 hours a week. Part of that is because the next time I come, I want to be less foolish. So there's a kind of building skills for what will come next that happen. They're very ordinary skills. Learning another language. It's very ordinary. Also, there's the practice of getting all masked up and going for a walk on the beach with somebody else. You know, it's not that we can connect carefully. We can talk, we can connect, we can't have everybody over to dinner and have that kind of thing. I can't have a seminar with young students and talk about writing and share papers, but we can have a speculative future writing workshop and share, the students can do, share each other's writing, comment on each other's writing. The materiality of living in pandemia, this continent called pandemia, which involves understanding something about virus justice. For example, we're watching the wealthy fractions and the wealthy countries buy up vaccines. We are watching the slowness of vaccination in areas that are more impacted by racism and extraction and exploitation and poverty and colonialism. We are watching virus injustice, if you will, vaccine injustice, virus injustice, coupled with an extraordinary ignorance about what viruses do. You know, if you allow the numbers of organisms infected by a virus to grow out of control, the virus is in a banquet. The virus is having a fabulous time. It's evolutionary heaven. The virus can mutate and mutate and mutate and produce variant after variant after variant to defeat the vaccines, unless we practice vaccine justice. Unless everybody practices vaccine justice, the virus will kill hundreds of thousands more people, maybe more than it otherwise would have. Virus justice, vaccine justice, involves understanding that we need to limit the banquet that the virus has. Just keep it with tiny, stingy meals and make the virus hungry, okay? We will never exterminate the virus, and thinking in terms of exterminism is a really bad idea. It's a kind of nuke the enemy. No, figure out how to live in relative balance with this new virus and the others to come in such a way that we understand how the food markets, the wild and domestic animals, the human beings and different kinds of labor practices, different kinds of medical practices can live in relative balance on a wounded planet without the fantasy of immortality and killing death. Yeah. So I think that writers right now, my godson, who is 26 years old and has very strong visual and artistic practices, is out of work, was working in a grocery store, has been living at home with his mother, my dear friend and colleague, and has been doing a lot of photography and some very evocative writing that ties, that is, it's a kind of, he's a young man and he's chronicling his passage through this time in photography, in writing, in drawing, in collage. And he's lonely and he's hurting. He wants people, he needs people. The other folks his age need people more than I do. I have, they really, you know, the damage done to youngsters is much more than the damage done to the healthy elderly. I'm not talking about the elderly who are not healthy. That's a different issue. You know, we have resources. So how I'm watching him transmute the trauma, not deny it, but transmute it into something material and artistically interesting.
Yeah.
And I think writers do the same thing.
And perhaps challenging these preconceived ideas of what a genre is, and doing a lot of challenging, more radical work, in fact, if we want to embrace the world in which we live right now. I wanted to, I so much agree about vaccine justice. That's something that we need. Virus justice as well. Every time that I open my Twitter feed in the morning, I come to face more and more people grieving for lost ones. That's the last question I'm gonna ask you, because I'm sure other people want to ask you something else. And in a way, you touched upon this already, but I was very moved by some of the early pages of your book, when you speak not only about learning how to live, but about learning how to die. And dying is something that we do with others. I mean, there is the work of the death, as Thomas Lacour talked about and documented so well. The wake work that Cristina Schab talked about in that book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. I've been talking for quite a while about grieving precisely as the type of work and practice that connects us with others in very extreme circumstances. And you speak about living with loss, right? Mm-hmm. Perhaps in a very similar way that you are describing this vaccine justice and this virus justice. We have to learn to live with this, and perhaps it would be just so fitting right now for you to speak a little bit about that, as many of the people who join us, I'm sure, are going through very extreme circumstances as well.
Yes. And in a couple of days, I will join a memorial for a colleague from San Diego, Leslie Stern.
Oh no, really?
Died a few days ago, and I will send you the link.
Oh, I didn't know. So sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So it was not COVID, but
yeah,
a loss of a friend, a writer, a colleague.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also writing a blurb. Let me put my hand on this book. I can. Yes. I'm writing a blurb. Wait a minute. Okay. Wake.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a graphic comic book by an amazing artist and writer and activist, Rebecca Hall, who was also an historian and a graduate student. And I was, in some sense, her teacher for some of the years that she was at UCSC. She writes this graphic novel about the wake, living in the wake. And she means the word wake, and I think this addresses the question of mourning rather than melancholia. She uses the word wake in all of its senses, including its Black African-American sense of being woke, wake, okay? Living in the wake of slavery, living wake, having a wake, having a ceremony of mourning, but so as to bring into the living the dead, so as to bring the dead into the living, but the living also into the dead, so that living and dying in connection with the extraordinary histories of women in slave revolts. The topic of this book is Black women in slave revolts, from the ships of the Atlantic slave trade to now in Black Lives Matter. The founders of Black Lives Matter are amazing Black women. Yeah. And Rebecca does this amazing graphic novel, which is about time, about revolutionary practice, about living and dying, about mourning, about taking in that which you can't take in because it's too terrible, but you must. And I think living in pandemia, living in times of COVID, taking in the weight of excess death. Dying is, it's not like an old person dying is unusual. It's sad, of course, but the weight of excess elderly dying alone in terrible circumstances where they cannot be held by those they love and those who love them. The weight of excess death and lonely death that an epidemic, that infectious disease brings with it. Somehow taking that in so as to be more lively, not in the sense of some transcendental sense, but responsive to, able to feel with, so as to experience laughter and joy and sadness so as to bear the weight lightly.
Yeah.
And surely living in time of climate destruction, climate change, in an era of extinctionism, extractivism and extinctionism. And there will be no going back to the state before. There will be no status quo ante, but there can be less damage. There can be new kinds of flourishing. There can be remembering old kinds of flourishing and inventing new kinds of flourishing amidst the destruction, so as to engage in partial healing, partial connection, so as to be, in a way, ordinary again. So as to be ordinary creatures among other ordinary creatures again, and not human exceptionalists.
Yeah, I very much appreciate your words. This idea that when we cannot aim for total healing, partial healing is okay. That's what we can do, right? And that love, when we are serious about love, when we claim to love something, it will take us to so many other places in this continuous material tracing of being. So I'll cherish that, and I'll keep that with me. Some of the things that have allowed me to go through this pandemic all these months have been reading very closely some thinkers from Latin America. Many of them, I think, speaking very much along your ideas of the common good, about collectivity and working with others. I've been reading, as I think many in Mexico, the work by a very young linguist, Yasnaya Aguilar, the work by Mije anthropologist Floriberto Diaz, the work by Gladys Tzutzul, the work by a plethora of young thinkers for whom the land is not a given, for whom the land and the way in which we relate to the land is a dynamic, a practice, and with its own agency, so to speak. So those are some of the ideas that I'm creating ideas with, the stories with which I'm telling stories about. And before someone else asks you questions, and I don't even know if we're gonna have time for that, but I would love to know, right now, Donna Haraway, who are you thinking ideas with? What stories are allowing you to go through these very challenging times?
There are probably several ways to answer that question, but I want to do it with this book.
Let's see.
Cattail Stories.
Okay.
By Graciela Trevisan, who is Argentinian by origin.
Okay.
These are stories set in the town of Cattails in Argentina, where she was born. Okay. Written in English, published in English. I teach English as a second language to a migrant, a Spanish-speaking migrant woman in Santa Cruz. And these stories, she then will she will read a cattail story and write a story in English in response, which helps her remember her grandmother, her roots, her town in Oaxaca, that helps her connect to her daughters. She's writing these absolutely extraordinary stories in response to Graciela's stories. Mm-hmm. And then I take Cecilia's stories and send them to Graciela, and then take from Graciela some of her references to South American thinkers. For example, the singer and composer Violeta Parra, the Chilean singer, mm-hmm. who occurred in one of these stories. So I watched this in Spanish, beautiful animated claymation and embroidered animation of the biografía de Violeta Parra.
Yeah.
Cantar con sentido, la biografía de Violeta Parra. And so I watched this amazing 20-minute Spanish language animated, poetic. The prose is sheer poetry. It's really amazing. With her music in the background, while for English lessons, Cecilia is reading Graciela's transmutation of her Argentinian childhood into English. So I am thinking with Graciela and Cecilia and the characters of this story and the kind of magical realism that Graciela draws on in order to write her stories. So it's a tiny little book, and it's very simple, okay? But it helps me think with a whole company of women whom I need right now.
A labor of love too, right? The serious love.
Yeah.
Amor correspondido.
Sí. Sí, gracias a la vida también.
Virginia, I think this would be a good time to get some questions from, I bet you have many of them.
Hola, sí, de hecho sí hay muchas preguntas. A ver cómo nos organizamos. A ver, llegaremos a lo que podamos. Una disculpa si no podemos hacerlas todas. Voy a intentar irlas leyendo. I'm going to read the questions. Hay varias que preguntaban sobre qué estaba leyendo Donna actualmente y también Cristina. Creo que ya Donna ha contestado un poco con estas referencias del cómic Wake, de Cattle Stories. But I don't know, Donna, if you want to add some of your recent readings. Y en esta de las lecturas también preguntan si Donna ha leído Esferas de la insurrección de Sueli Rolnik, esta teórica brasileña. Y esa sobre las lecturas. También otra relacionada con lecturas preguntan a si Donna se considera bióloga, if you consider yourself as a biologist, and if you know the work of the French Edgar Morin, what do you think about it? Si quieres, avancemos con estas y luego seguimos con algunas más.
That's for you.
The first one, and then we can continue maybe.
Yeah, two questions, but I think of myself as a biologist, but I've never done experimental work in biology, so I'm a very poor biologist. But I read and I maintain connections with colleagues, and it influences what I write and do profoundly. I write and think and live and act as an organism, as a biologist. I care about the biology and I translate it for my friends all the time. So that's to the first question. The second question, repeat the second question again.
It was more about your readings. I think it's something that you have mentioned during the conversation, no? With these two references that you mentioned, but especially if you know the work of Sueli Rolnik.
I don't, I should.
Okay, and a work that it's about Esferas de la Insurrección, Insurrection Spheres.
No, I don't, but I would like to, so that person should send me an email.
Okay. Okay. No sé si Cristina quieras comentar tú algo que estabas también leyendo, que era una de las preguntas también.
Bueno, yo algunas de las cosas que he estado leyendo las mencioné en mi introducción, porque conforme iba leyendo el trabajo de Donna, como es tan poroso y como ofrece tantos puntos de contacto, iba acordándome de cosas, ¿no? De autores. Mencioné recientemente este trabajo de Christina Sharp, In the Wake, que me pareció fundamental. Tengo mucho tiempo leyendo a Fred Moten, su poesía y sus ensayos. Recientemente acabo de leer el libro de Silvia Federici, que me parece una escritora fundamental, pero del encantamiento, reencantamiento de lo real. Y me encantaría, no sé si Donna conoce el trabajo de Yasnaya Aguilar y de Floriberto Díaz, but and I don't think, I think Yasnaya's work is being translated into English, just a couple of articles, but I just see so many connections between Yasnaya's work and your ideas about connection and working with others and you know what, all that we've been talking about. So I want to ask her to shoot you an email too.
Good.
Okay. Pues si quieren voy con alguna más. Esta es un poco larga. Dice, la leo primero en español y luego intentemos traducirla. Dice, ¿qué opina Donna de las críticas que se han hecho desde el feminismo afroamericano, como Zaquilla y Man Jackson, a la propuesta posthumana? ¿Qué opina de los grupos subalternizados y racializados que han sido bestializados desde la perspectiva antropoeurocéntricas? ¿Y qué sugiere que primero habría que humanizar a los deshumanizados ¿Y qué opina de las etnografías multiespecie como las desarrolladas por Deborah Beard-Rose y las humanidades medioambientales? ¿Las siente más cercanas que el ejemplo de perspectivismo amerindio de Viverius de Castro? I'm trying to translate because I think it's a complex question and with many questions at the same time. What do you think, Donna, of the critics that they have been made through the Afro-American feminists like Zakiya Iman Jackson to the post-human proposal? What do you think of the subaltern groups racialized and that have been make peace from the perspective of the Eurocentric, anthropo-Eurocentric? What do you suggest that has to be humanized first to dehumanize? And what do you think about multi-species ethnographies like the ones that have been developed by Deborah Bird? Do you think that are closer to the perspectivism from Viverius de Castro? I don't know if I'm clear.
De Castro. That's a very complex set of issues. First, I have never considered myself part of posthumanism, though I have a kind of alliance. Posthumanism can be understood in many ways. It can be understood as a kind of slash through the exceptionalism of humanism, a kind of revaluing of what it is to be a human being among other beings, and so on. But I've always preferred to work and think in languages other than the theoretical languages of posthumanism for reasons that aren't too different from the critiques made by people like Saadia Hartman and others. I think that I want to work myself and read others who work historically and experientially from different idioms that are rooted in different historical experiences, which do not exclude the Euro-Atlantic, for example, or the Anglo-North American, or what have you, or the Australian colonial settlers, who have produced some amazing, remarkable thinkers, feminists among them, people I don't want to live without. But I want to think more and more with and through with the writers like Kim Tallbear, like Joanne Barker, like Kealawe Kauanui, like many others, and also the ethnographers like Eduardo Cohn, but Viverius de Castro and Deborah Danowski too, and their students, Juliana Fausto and others. I am not strict about sorting whether drawing from one area or another is legitimate. I am completely promiscuous. And I'm yearning. I read the biologists who work in the areas of multi-species interactions through the developmental history and the ecological history of a group of organisms, because I need what they're doing to relate to the earth. Okay, I need to be reading. There are now, as there have always been some, but now there are a lot of Indigenous writers from many different kinds of communities and many different kinds of places. And it would be a terrible mistake to talk about an Indigenous perspective. But now there is printed scholarship, printed fiction, podcasts, video productions, film, you name it. It is now irresponsible not to become more and more literate in the many productions of Indigenous thinkers from all sorts of areas and situations. And I don't think, posthumanism is not necessarily a bad thing, but it has not prioritized that project, I think. Some people who think of themselves as posthumanists do. I think Rosi Predati does, for example. But I don't find the formation itself, it doesn't privilege that kind of learning and thinking and reading with that I want to be more actively doing. Okay. I think that answers your question a little bit about ethnography too. Ethnography is, of course, a colonial practice, but what isn't? it is also more than a colonial practice. It is not nothing but a colonial practice. And ethnographers have entered into an extraordinary array of alliances and critical rethinkings and reworkings. And ethnographic practice, I think, is a domain, including feminist multi-species ethnographic practice, which does not just act like a kind of kidnapper and kidnap another species. That one cannot write a multi-species ethnography by analogy or by kidnapping the consciousness of another, etc. How? What would be the materiality of writing, thinking, feeling, reporting that which is not human? There's no answer to that, because it's a permanent searching, a permanent task. And the minute one thinks as a specificity matters, and I think we are in multiple connection with both human beings and other than human beings. It's not that we are, we don't have to sit in our closet all by ourselves and imagine what it is to be a dog. We are in actual relationships with real dogs. And we can write and think and speak from that, including ethnographically. What we can never do is claim to know the other, including the other human being, and for that matter, the other of oneself. That kind of search for a kind of non-dogmatic ethnographic investigation into life on Earth. So yeah, I like multi-species ethnographies, particularly the ones that don't make them speak English or Spanish, for that matter.
Thank you, Donna. There are several questions referred to the idea that making, not babies. Comentan, ¿nos podría hablar un poco más de su idea making, not babies? Y dicen, por ejemplo, el parentesco multiespecies es una oportunidad de curar la pandemia del terror desatada por el COVID, o how multispecies justice is connected with other ways of making.
Yeah, the making not babies gets me in lots of trouble, of course, because it so easily falls into the racist, eugenicist practices of white supremacy. And so I have tried to be very careful, and at the same time not deny the weight of humanity on the planet, and especially the weight of wealthy humanity, the cost to the earth of wealthy humanity, of wealthy human beings having their 1 and 2 and 3 babies, what that costs to the earth to engage in what I think of as excess reproduction of the wealthy first. And also the problem of numbers that are not just the question of the wealthy, and that people all over the world are themselves already addressing. For example, the birth rate of human beings has fallen all over the world. People make their reproductive decisions in relation to their socio-ecologies all over the world, including fewer babies, practically everywhere, except in some super extracted, super exploited areas. That's way too simple. But the question of numbers of human beings, I think, is one that must be addressed, but addressing it is almost impossible because of the history of racism and eugenics. That's the first thing. The other thing is that I think multi-species environmental and reproductive justice must be the practice. That means human beings and other than human beings, multi-species environmental and reproductive justice. So that in the cities, by the way, I find basically, for example, red deal, Native American indigenous red deal, which is a tremendous enlargement, and other than the Green Deal, takes very seriously environmental justice in a multi-species way, takes very seriously the relationship of peoples, indigenous peoples, relationships with the more than human as the normal way of being. So that multi-species environmental and reproductive justice is not, the ideas and the practices are not going to come probably principally from the Euro-Atlantic axis. There will be contributions, of course, but the principal insights about multi-species reproductive and environmental justice are already coming from people's who are reclaiming their lives and their relationships and reproductive capacities with other than outside Euro-Atlantic domination. It's way too simplistic, but it's a start.
Thank you. And I think it's going to be the last question, al menos que tú, Cristina, quieras comentar algo, pero ya me están apretando con los tiempos.
Adelante.
Dice, ¿qué opinas, Donna, de la propuesta pero me parece que es interesante esta pregunta. ¿Qué opina de la propuesta de la red de sanadoras ancestrales que se teje desde el feminismo comunitario territorial y los saberes recuperados desde la voz de mujeres como Lorena Cabnal y su vínculo con el cuerpo y con la memoria?
Give me some English so I don't misunderstand.
Yeah, what do you think of the proposal of the net of the ancestral, ¿cómo diríamos, sanadoras?
Healers.
Healers.
Mm-hmm.
That nets from the territorial communitarian feminism, from the ancestral knowledge, from the voice of the woman, like Lorena Cabnal, and the link with the body and the memory.
Yeah. Well, it's better than the Christian God. I don't want to be dismissive. I have a very large soft spot for the traditions of women healers, for the traditions of the witches in their material practices, for example, in European traditions, and other practices of healing and spirituality and community healing of the land. And I am allergic to ways that, at least in my receiving it, in my understanding, a kind of appropriation of indigenous ideas and representing them as a kind of feminist communitarianism too easily, much too easily. Losing the complexity of women's practices and indigenous practices, both by women and by men in many areas of the world, both contemporary and past, and a kind of, I don't know, I have a tendency to be allergic, even while I think the work is important. And I know communities of practice, for example, women farmers who are engaged in this kind of work that I think is pretty amazing, and for which I have large respect. I just think it's complicated, and that I have a certain allergy to what seems to go toward, well, maybe I was vaccinated against religion at a certain point, having grown up a very serious Catholic for many years, and I worry about that.
Thank you for the answer. It was a complex question.
Not easy. It's not simple.
Yo creo, I think maybe we can close here. Invitaría a Sara y a Ekaterina a sumarse, aunque sea virtualmente, aquí en imagen. No sé si Cristina quieras decir algo para cerrar.
I just want to thank Donna for her time and energy and sharing, making world with us right now through this Zoom connection. And I'm so happy, I'm thrilled to be part of this celebration, la llegada de este editorial a México, estos libros preciosos que esperamos que circulen mucho y que conecten mucho y que nos ayuden a crear otro presente más habitable, más hospitalario. Muchas gracias a todos por la invitación y gracias a todos los que estuvieron aquí y gracias a todos los que tuvieron que trabajar para hacer esto posible.
Sí, y mí también gracias a todos.
Gracias a ustedes por esta presentación.
Y Cristina.
Gracias a todos.
Me toca
Todas
decir que vayan por sus libros, pero también decirles que he estado muy conmovida por la plática en muchos momentos. Thank you, Donna. I have been moved by your words and by Cristina words along this conversation. So thank you very much. Y sobre todo también gracias a Consonni por la confianza y pues estamos en librerías. Búsquennos.
Las ediciones son preciosas, las recomendamos mucho también. Gracias.
Gracias por venir a México, Donna. Un abrazo a todas.
Las editoras. Gracias.
Gracias.